Okay, homeostasis comes from the Greek homeo, meaning similar, and stasis, meaning static and changing. And it refers to the properties of living systems and others, sometimes systems in general, to maintain a constant internal environment. So it's a definition: all living systems, any animals, cells, plants, all maintain homeostasis. And it's the process of keeping the internal environment relatively stable. This doesn't mean that there are never any changes. It means that that it's changing constantly. It's a very dynamic process by which the body keeps, or living system keeps, important variables within a somewhat narrow range. Body temperature is a great example of this. The average human body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius. If you go and pick up a thermometer and take your body temperature right now, it may be a little higher than that, a little lower than that. It will change through the day, but it changes within a narrow range. If we took the body temperature of everybody in the class, unless someone's ill, it's probably going to be plus or minus a degree from 37 degrees. And it changes relatively constantly. It's different when we get up in the morning than when we are exercising in the middle of the afternoon. But it stays within a narrow range, and that's what the process of homeostasis refers to. One of the major misconceptions is that it's keeping things still. It's not keeping things still. It's just when something changes in one way, it pulls it back and prevents it from changing in the other way. Homeostatic systems have a way they tend to work. The first thing is the variable, which is what is getting monitored. So in our body temperature example, an example of a variable would be body temperature. For homeostasis to work, there has to be a receptor or sensor for the variable. So for body temperature to be maintained relatively constant, there has to be a way for the body to sense that when the temperature changes. So in the case of body temperature, there's a number of sensory receptors in the skin that will send a nervous signal whenever the body temperature is changed. This signal gets sent to a control center that will then integrate the signal and decide what the body is going to do to compensate for the change. In the example of body temperature, it's sensed by receptors, sensory receptors that will detect the temperature. That gets sent via a sensory neuron to the control center, which is the brain. The brain will then send an efferent signal on another neuron that's going to go and tell the effectors what to do. The effectors are what's going to make the change in the homeostatic system. So effectors will change, is what actually causes the change in the variable. So for example, so effector changes the variable. The receptor or sensor senses it, the control center makes the decision, the effector changes it. In this case, the effector would be things like our sweat glands if we're too hot, blood vessels in our skin, when you get overheated, your skin gets flushed and red as more blood flows through it so we can cool. Effectors would also be things such as goosebumps and sort of chills as our muscles become more active to warm us up. If we're too hot, we'd have things like sweat glands and increased blood flow to warm us. If we're too cold, get goosebumps and chills where we get more muscle activity to warm us up. Homeostatic control mechanisms include different types of feedback systems. The most common type of feedback system is called negative feedback. Negative feedback is when the changes elicited by the effector, what the effector does, counteracts the original variable. So in the case of body temperature, if the sensor senses that body temperature is too high, it sends the signal via a nervous pathway to the brain, which serves as the control center. The control center will then send an efferent signal, or a signal away from the control center, to parts of the skin like sweat glands. Sweat glands will be the effector that will cause us to sweat. As we sweat, the sweat will cool us. And since we were originally too hot, now we're cooler. The direction of the change is opposite the variable that was originally sensed. A lot like a household thermostat. If the temperature is too high, you do something to cool it. And once it gets cooler, it's no longer sensing that it's too warm and it stops cooling. That's negative feedback. Negative feedback does not mean bad. It does not mean that it's detrimental. Negative feedback is often necessary and a positive thing in the body. So many students get confused and think negative must mean it's bad, but it's not. Negative just means that the direction of the change opposes or reduces the intensity of the original variable. Another example of this besides body temperature is blood glucose regulation. So you go across the street and get a Frappuccino from Starbucks, or you eat a healthier lunch like an apple. Either way, you're consuming nutrients. And after the meal, or assuming a coffee that has a tiny bit of sugar in it, you're going to absorb glucose or sugar through the intestines. As your blood sugar rises, that's sensed in the pancreas. This increase in blood glucose in the pancreas, sensed by the pancreas, will cause the control center, the pancreas, again, the pancreas is serving both roles here, it's the sensor and the control center. The pancreas will secrete a hormone called insulin. Insulin will then travel to your fat, your liver, and your muscles and cause them to remove glucose from the blood and store it inside the cells. This causes the blood glucose level to go down. As the glucose gets removed from the blood, the glucose level drops. So originally it was high glucose sensed by the pancreas, causing the pancreas to secrete insulin. The insulin removes the blood glucose, and so the original signal is diminished. That's a classic example of negative feedback. Often homeostasis works a bit like a teeter-totter. There can be opposing ways to regulate a variable. A variable can be too high or it can be too low. The case we just gave with blood glucose was an example where blood glucose went up, sensed by the pancreas. The pancreas secretes insulin, which causes the effectors, muscle, liver, and fat, to remove glucose from the blood. We also, say 2 or 3 hours after you eat, your blood glucose level may drop. It may get lower than the homeostatic range that your body prefers. As the blood glucose level drops, it's also sensed by the pancreas. But in this case, the pancreas as the control center, rather than secreting insulin, will secrete a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon will leave the pancreas, and it will have effects on the liver and the fat and the muscle. But it does the opposite of what insulin does. Insulin causes these to take glucose from the blood and store it. Glucagon will cause the muscle, the bone, the fat, and the liver to release glucose. All that glucose that was stored earlier will now get released, And as these tissues release glucose, the blood glucose level rises. Again, this opposes the original stimulus and is an example of negative feedback. The other type of homeostatic feedback is positive feedback. Positive feedback is relatively rare in the human body, in a healthy human body. And again, like negative feedback is not bad. It just describes how the variable changes in response to the effector. Positive feedback is not always good. Examples of positive feedback are when something happens and it causes more of the same thing to happen. It's like a feed-forward loop. A great example of this is with blood clotting. So you get a cut. Blood is leaving the blood vessels. You're bleeding. Well, a platelet, wandering through the blood, a platelet will stick to the side of the blood vessel. As the platelet sticks, it becomes activated, and the activated platelet will secrete factors that will recruit other platelets. So the platelet is the sensor. It senses the break in the blood vessel. It's the control center because it binds to the blood vessel. And as it overcomes its inhibition to release these chemicals, it releases these chemicals that recruit other platelets, and that's the effector. As the other platelets come, they bind to the original platelet, they become activated, secrete more chemicals, and recruit even more platelets. So unlike negative feedback, which the change stops the loop, positive feedback keeps the loop going in a feed forward. You do something that causes more of it, which causes even more of it. So positive feedback, it seems like it doesn't commonly maintain homeostasis because homeostasis should reverse a change. Positive feedback takes it forward. That's one of the reasons it's relatively rare in the body. It happens with blood clotting because it will proceed until the blood stops leaving the blood vessel and homeostasis is restored. It also happens, other examples in the body are with lactation or breastfeeding, labor. When a woman is delivering a child, the process of labor and delivery is a positive feedback loop. There's an example in the female body involving ovulation. But and typically, most of our feedback systems in the human body are negative feedback. To go through one more of the examples of positive feedback, we'll talk about a woman giving birth. So as a pregnant woman has a baby inside, it's getting ready to be born, it presses and puts pressure on the cervix and the walls of the uterus. The muscles in the uterus sense that stretching, and they send a signal to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus pituitary part of the brain, and they release a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin will then travel in the blood, go to the uterus, and cause the uterus to constrict even more. It will cause the muscles in the uterus to contract, hence a contraction. When that contraction happens, that causes the muscle to stretch even more, because as it's trying to contract on the baby, it causes it to stretch even more, which sends the signal back to the brain to cause more oxytocin to be released, to cause the next contraction to be harder. So it's a feed-forward loop. And when you think about it, the examples I've given you, labor, breastfeeding, and blood clotting, all involve sort of reversing a stimulus that's not, in the case of breastfeeding and labor, not necessarily outside the body, but it's involving something not completely internal. It's reversing a change that's almost imposed on the system. A lot of cases of dyshomeostasis in the human body is when a negative feedback system becomes a positive feedback system. So often, positive feedback is a sign of disease. An example of this would be with diabetes. If someone has diabetes mellitus, also known as sugar diabetes, when they eat, the blood glucose goes up. If they have, and assuming we're talking type 2 diabetes here, the pancreas will then secrete insulin. It goes, the muscles and bones and the muscles, the fat, and the liver ignore the insulin. The blood glucose level stays high. So you take away the negative feedback, and that becomes dyshomeostasis. So it's not that positive is good and negative is bad. It's that negative causes the variable to change in the opposite direction that it changed initially. So if blood glucose goes up, negative feedback will elicit a change that makes it go down. If the body's too cold, negative feedback will do something that causes the body to warm up. Positive feedback is when a change elicits more of the same. So positive feedback is when something happens, like a platelet binds and releases chemicals, and that causes more platelets to bind and release more chemicals, which cause even more platelets to bind and release even more chemicals. There's less of a turn-off system in positive homeostasis, where negative is very much like a household thermostat.